Valor Magules, more like Valor Mabules, am I right? The world was truly lucky to get Game of Thrones. Not since Lord of the Rings had the fantasy genre got such a rocket strapped to it in regards to mainstream popularity. If you weren't watching, then you were a total loser. But as time went on, it became the viewers who were the losers, as the show lived long enough to see itself become the villain. However, for those out there who wanted something similar but better, there was a great option. Vikings was created by Michael Hurst for the History Channel, and it was everything people wanted to see from Game of Thrones. While it may have begun life as an attempt to cash in on Game of Thrones' popularity, it ended up exceeding it in many ways. So, let's talk about it, by listing 10 reasons why Vikings was actually better than Game of Thrones. And remember, this is an opinion piece from a puppet, so if you get angry, you're getting angry at a puppet. No one comes out of that looking like a winner. Number 10. The violence wasn't just for show. Most people think of fantasy lands as a lovely meadow full of fairies and elves, so it's safe to say they shouldn't look for real estate in Westeros. Game of Thrones was jam-packed, emphasis on the jam, with overtly gory violence. This was part of what helped the show to attain success, as it was so different to what people were used to in fantasy. But it did often feel a little hollow. The violence often didn't match the tone of the story and just felt like a cheap exploit to gain some shock value. Sometimes it was a little bit cartoonish, and that's coming from someone who doesn't even have a human circulatory system. Then there was Vikings. Seeing the Northmen tear people apart in battle felt so natural, as that's the reputation Vikings had. Plus, the brutality never went too far. Be not mistaken, it gave you some horribly grim moments, but everything was believable thanks to the fact that it led somewhere. If something was violent, it was for a reason, and this proved that it wasn't all for show. Number 9. Complex protagonists. Don't get me wrong, Game of Thrones was hardly close to feeling like Riverdale, but you can't say the leading characters were anything too complex. Jon Snow, for example. I can't think of a more cookie-cutter hero than him. Just because he's pretty and has got a northern accent doesn't mean he's a character of Shakespearean proportion. The protagonists in this show just felt flat most of the time, as their motives were decent, but they lacked nuance. It was always, I want to be queen, or I'm the good guy, blah blah. Sure, they were likeable, but nothing exceptional, except maybe early Tyrion. It was the supporting characters who took the biscuit. Theon, the Hound, Littlefinger, that's where the complexity was at. Whereas in Vikings, everybody was special. Just look at the main lead, Ragnar. This dude was full of interesting flaws, like addiction and a tendency to make awful decisions, but he still felt like the hero because of his ambition and drive. And don't even get me started on Lagertha and the Sons of Ragnar. They were all filled with nuance, with even the weakest feeling like fully fledged people. Except Sigurd. That dude was the Viking equivalent of a red shirt. Number 8. Better female characters. Give me Lagertha over Sansa any day of the week, including Thorin's Day, which isn't even a day, I just made it up to make my point stronger. The thing is, when Game of Thrones did female characters good, they were great. Cersei, she's still one of the best characters on TV, and Daenerys was awesome, up until a point. It does deserve plenty of credit for great female role models, but not all of them were that strong. Sansa, for example, was very poorly consistent, and most of the other women just came along to get naked and die. Vikings, on the other hand, was chock full of amazing women. Lagertha, Astrid, Torvi, Siggy, Brunhild, and that's just scratching the surface. The roles of women in Viking society was fascinating as they experienced so many issues, but had stronger positions as warriors, leading to the characters passing the Bechdel test and delivering one of the most female-empowered, loose fantasy shows on TV. Number 7. Quality over quantity. To be fair, this might have been more out of necessity than creative license, as Vikings didn't have the budget to create things on a grand scale, but still, it deserves to be noted that the show's focus on distinct characters, a smaller cast, and less subplots made it feel concise. Even towards the end, when they were chucking a fair bit more at you, it still felt consistent thanks to everything drawing back to the Sons of Ragnar. Then there's Game of Thrones, which got so overcrowded and overblown towards the end that it felt like EastEnders rather than a fantasy series. There were so many storylines, characters, and settings that it felt like you were hopping all over the place, struggling to keep track. While that did make the show feel truly epic, it diluted the quality of the series, and that wasn't a pothole that Vikings fell into. Not too hard, at least. Number 6, less focus on gratuitous hanky-panky. This is an awkward one to discuss as a puppet, because I don't have much experience in the matter. Now, it does need to be stated that Vikings was no stranger to a cheeky romp or two. In fact, it was an integral part of the show, but where it beat Game of Thrones was in its lack of crudeness. Sure, there were a couple of moments that were too much, looking at you, Lagertha and King Harold, but all the lovemaking scenes were relevant to the story and felt necessary to establish relationships and power dynamics. Then of course you got Game of Thrones, which at times would make even the most stoutest of persons blush. The lovemaking scenes in this show were ludicrous, and while they caught the audience's attention at first, it got to the point where people were hoping it would chill out and focus on the story. Do you know how hard you gotta overdo it to get people to ask for less nudity on TV? It's quite a lot. Number 5, less unnecessary characters. This one kinda ties into the quality over quantity thing, but deserves a whole entry to itself because, geez, Game of Thrones was just obsessed with bringing in characters and either losing them right away or doing nothing with them. Most of the time you'd meet a new person and judge within the first few minutes whether they'd stick around or not. This made it quite hard to invest in the new additions at times. Vikings was no stranger to introducing and departing people quickly, but even the most insignificant of characters had a purpose. No one was introduced to be cannon fodder for the shocking death quota, and they brought something to the show that was either needed, wanted, or drove the story forward. Wouldn't you rather get to know someone who means something as opposed to a walking piece of nothing? Number 4, the grittier visuals. Despite what many people may say, looks are important, depending on what those looks are. As a ginger, I understand that plight. While Game of Thrones was lauded for being an amazing and cinematic-looking TV series, there was still something about it that didn't quite match the tone. The show was full of bright colours, which were inviting, but had a glossiness that made it look a little cartoonish at times. This was particularly evident in the violence and cinematic moments that did look amazing, but weren't very realistic. I know Game of Thrones is a fantasy, but the shiny coating just made it a bit too much at times. While Vikings played into some very non-believable ideas, there was a dirtiness and grime to the aesthetic that captured a way stronger vibe of what life in this scenario would be like. I mean, people didn't have head and shoulders back then, so they'd naturally look a little bit gross. Speaking of, I'd like to thank our sponsor Head and... Just kidding, as if someone would sponsor a puppet. Number 3, more consistent battle scenes. This entry needs to begin by pointing out that, yes, technically Game of Thrones battles were better. If you're looking for spectacle and variety, the Battle of the Bastards and Hardhome are some of the most incredible sequences in fantasy. Sure, they don't rival Helm's Deep, but they gave it a bit of a run for its money. With that being said, those kind of battles came along once in a blue moon, and the majority of the epic encounters felt like they consumed the entire season's budget like a black hole. Vikings did have some of these incredible moments like Ragnarok and that final battle, but even without those, it was a consistent source of action. Every encounter between the Vikings and enemies was brutal and intense, and each attack meant something. The battles weren't necessarily better, but they were a lot more consistent. You still got those special big moments, but didn't feel like you were sacrificing the other action scenes for it. Number 2, the fantasy elements were way more grounded. Now, it's completely fair to not expect your fantasy series to be grounded, but Game of Thrones prided itself on how realistic it was, with death, conspiracy, and politics alongside the dragons and magic. Thanks to this, the more fantastical elements felt great, but a little juxtaposed to the politics of Westeros. At times, it felt like you were watching a show that was a Frankenstein's monster of storytelling. I mean, take the last 2 episodes for example. There were really 2 endings to this show. There was the ending of the Night King and then the ending of the battle in Westeros, and sticking the 2 together just felt a little bit off. It wasn't very satisfying because, well, those worlds just didn't blend as well. Vikings instead offered the viewers a far more subtle approach to the fantasy, which didn't just help the coherence of the series, but also made the magical elements far more mysterious. It was easy to see how fantasy such as visions, witches and gods could be explained rationally, but there was also a great sense of the supernatural things that could exist in this world. Was Aslog really a witch? Was Ragnar really a descendant of Odin? And who on earth was Harbard? You never got a full answer, and while that sounds frustrating, it actually helped the show to feel like a perfect blend of history and fantasy. Exactly what you'd expect from the History Channel. Yeah. At least there weren't aliens involved in this one. And number 1, most importantly, it didn't decline in quality. Look, I'm not going to stand here and say that Vikings was just as good at the end as it was in the beginning, mainly because I'm a puppet, so I can't stand, but also because it wasn't. While the show never really managed to completely outdo earlier seasons like 3 and 4, it didn't take a drastic decline in quality, and that's quite rare for a long-running show. Game of Thrones, on the other hand, well, might be the biggest example of a series slowly declining in quality and becoming loathed by its fanbase. If you loved Game of Thrones towards its conclusion just as much as its early days, then you're either in denial or employed by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. Look, I won't be here completely tearing the finale of Game of Thrones apart, mainly because that's been done enough, but I will point out that Vikings stayed consistently fantastic as it went along, shifted the attention of the characters well, and had a final episode that was genuinely satisfying. So, there you go. If you came out of this unconvinced, well, there's not much I can do about that. I'm just a lowly little fella who loves Vikings and was disappointed by the land of Westeros. But if you give me a like and a subscribe, then maybe I won't be so lowly anymore. And let's be honest, I don't have opposable thumbs, so I need about all the help I can get. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna make like Game of Thrones and Vikings now by coming to an end. Peace.